April 1945, Western Netherlands. The wooden floors of the school building in Octeville made creaking sounds under heavy army boots. Lieutenant General Charles Foulkes laid out maps on an old, scratch table. Outside, the Dutch countryside looked peaceful in the spring sunshine. But everyone in that room knew what was really happening. 4.5 million people were dying from hunger just a few miles away. 500 Dutch people were dying every single day. The number had become so normal that the officers barely reacted when they heard it anymore. 500 mothers, fathers, and children every single day. The situation had a name now. They called it the Hunger Winter. And it was killing a whole country. While the world watched, folks stared at the map, showing 6 Dutch areas still controlled by Germany. These weren't small places. Friesland, Groningen, Drenthe, Overijssel, North Holland, South Holland. 16,000 square kilometers of flooded farmland, old cities, and desperate people. The Germans had opened the water gates in 1944, flooding huge areas to slow down the Allied army's advance. It worked. Now the water sat there like a protective moat around a castle from long ago. But this castle held millions of prisoners who hadn't eaten a real meal in months. The Dutch people were eating tulip bulbs. They were eating sugar beets that were meant for cows. They were eating anything they could find. And still, they died by the hundreds every single day. The usual military thinking was clear and harsh. You attacked. You pushed forward with tanks and big guns. You fought street by street, house by house until the enemy gave up or died. British leaders had been doing it this way since 1939, and they saw no reason to change now. The plan was already made. The 1st Canadian Army would attack across the flooded lowlands, fight through protected German positions, and finally capture the major cities: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht. 4 of the most important cities in Europe, all packed with starving people and trapped German soldiers who had been ordered to fight to the death. The generals in London guessed it would take 3 months, maybe 4. They guessed 60,000 Allied soldiers would be killed or wounded. They didn't bother guessing how many Dutch civilians would die because the number was too terrible to say out loud. When you fight a city battle, through places filled with starving people, when you bomb apartment buildings and neighborhoods, when you flood streets with tank fire and artillery, people die. Lots of people. The British generals knew this. They accepted it as the price of winning. War was terrible, and terrible situations didn't allow for deals. But Charles Foulkes wasn't a typical general. He had started the war as an office officer, not a combat commander. Other generals had led troops at Normandy and fought through France. Foulkes had spent years behind desks, studying supplies and planning operations. The career combat officers looked down on him. They called him a paper general, a desk soldier, someone who understood paperwork better than battlefields. When he suggested something different, something that had never been tried before in this entire war, they immediately dismissed him. Foulkes wanted to negotiate. Not a surrender, not a ceasefire, but something stranger and more complicated. He wanted to offer the Germans a deal. Let the civilians eat. Let the Allies drop food. In exchange, the Germans wouldn't shoot down the planes. Then, once the immediate starvation crisis ended, they would talk about surrender. Not because Hitler ordered it, not because Berlin commanded it, but because it made sense. Because 120,000 German soldiers were cut off in the Netherlands with no supplies, no help coming, and no hope of winning. Because fighting would kill hundreds of thousands of people for absolutely no military reason. The British generals called it foolish, naive, and dangerous. Germans don't negotiate when they still have working armies. They said, Germans fight until they're dead or captured. That's what they did in Berlin. That's what they did in every city from Stalingrad to Aachen. Hitler's orders were clear. Fight to the last bullet. Burn everything. Leave nothing for the enemy. The Führer had given clear commands about the Netherlands. If the Germans couldn't hold it, they should destroy it. Flood more land, blow up the bridges, burn the ports, make sure the Allies got nothing but ruins and dead bodies. But Foulkes had been reading the intelligence reports that others ignored. German commanders in the Netherlands were trapped. Their supply lines had been cut for months. They were eating the same tulip bulbs as the Dutch civilians. The trains couldn't reach them. The German Air Force was gone. Berlin had stopped sending orders that made any sense because Berlin itself was surrounded by Soviet tanks. These German soldiers knew the war was over. They knew Hitler would be dead within days. They knew that fighting now meant dying for absolutely nothing. On April 28th, Foulkes sent a message through secret channels. A simple message to General Johannes Blaskowitz, commander of German forces in the Netherlands. Let's talk. Not about surrender terms, not about military positions, but about food, about keeping people alive, about finding a way to end this without turning Dutch cities into graveyards. The message went out through Dutch resistance fighters who had been operating in secret for 5 years. It reached Blaskowitz's headquarters within hours. The German general read it 3 times. He had been a soldier for 30 years. He had fought in Poland and France. He had commanded armies across Europe. He had never received a message like this. The Allies wanted to negotiate while he still controlled 6 provinces and commanded 120,000 armed troops. They wanted to feed civilians in territory he controlled. They wanted to talk before the shooting started. Every instinct told him it was a trick, a trap. The British trying to get inside his defenses before launching their real attack. But Blaskowitz also knew something that the Hitler Youth fanatics and SS officers didn't understand. He knew the war was over. He knew that Germany had lost. He knew that fighting now meant watching Dutch children starve, while German teenagers died defending ruins. He had received orders from Berlin to fight to the last man. He had received orders to destroy everything of value. He had received orders that would turn the Netherlands into a tomb. And for the first time in his military career, Johannes Blaskowitz considered doing something that could get him killed by his own side. He considered saying yes. The meeting room had been quickly prepared. Canadian officers sat on one side of a long wooden table. German officers sat on the other side. Outside, thousands of soldiers from both armies waited with loaded weapons, ready to start killing each other the moment these talks failed. Everyone expected them to fail. The challenge was enormous. Foulkes wasn't just trying to feed one city or one province. He needed to deliver food to 6 entire provinces, covering 16,000 square kilometers. 4.5 million people needed to eat. And they needed to eat soon, or the death count would climb from 500 per day to thousands. The Canadians had done the math. They needed to deliver 1,000 tons of food every single day just to keep people alive. Not healthy, not well fed, just alive. 1,000 tons meant hundreds of plane flights, thousands of packages, and perfect teamwork between forces that had been trying to kill each other for 6 years. Blaskowitz arrived in a staff car with 3 other German generals. He was 57 years old, tall and thin, with the stiff posture of a Prussian officer. He had commanded armies when most of the Canadians across the table were still in school. He wore his medals and his uniform perfectly pressed, even though he hadn't received new supplies in months. When he walked into the schoolhouse, he looked at Foulkes with the cold look of a professional soldier trying to figure out if this was real or a trap. Foulkes spoke first. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or military courtesies. He laid out maps showing the flight paths. British and Canadian bombers would fly over German positions at 400 feet, low enough to drop supply packages accurately, low enough that any German with a rifle could shoot them down. The planes would come in daylight. They would be completely defenseless. They would carry no bombs, no weapons, just food. Flour, canned meat, chocolate, medical supplies. The drops would happen whether or not Blaskowitz agreed to any surrender terms. The only question was whether German soldiers would shoot at planes trying to feed Dutch civilians. Blaskowitz studied the maps in silence. His officers whispered nervously behind him. One colonel pointed out the obvious problem. Hitler's orders were clear. No surrender, no negotiation. Any German officer who worked with the enemy would be killed. The SS had already shot generals for less. Just 2 weeks earlier, they had hanged officers in Berlin for suggesting that Germany should surrender. If Blaskowitz agreed to let Allied planes fly freely over German positions, if he allowed this unprecedented cooperation, he would be committing treason according to Nazi law. He would be a dead man. But Foulkes had expected this. He pulled out another document. Intelligence reports showing that Berlin was surrounded, that Hitler was trapped in his bunker, that the Soviet army was blocks away from the Reichstag. The war would be over within days, maybe hours. No one in Berlin would have time to execute anyone for treason in the Netherlands, because Berlin itself wouldn't exist as a functioning government much longer. Foulkes spoke quietly but clearly. You can follow orders from a dead government and watch millions of people starve, or you can do what makes sense and save lives on both sides. The German colonel objected immediately. Even if Berlin fell, the SS units in the Netherlands would never accept surrender. They had been taught Nazi ideas since childhood. They believed in fighting to the last bullet. If Blaskowitz allowed Allied planes through, if he opened negotiations, the SS would kill him before the Canadians could protect him. The colonel wasn't wrong. Everyone in that room knew about SS execution squads that hunted down officers who seemed disloyal. Blaskowitz would be signing his own death warrant. Foulkes had one more card to play. He brought in Canadian military government officers who specialized in helping people in need. They unrolled detailed plans showing exactly how food distribution would work. Canadian teams had already mapped every town, every neighborhood, every distribution point in the occupied provinces. They knew which buildings were still standing, which roads were still passable, which bridges hadn't been destroyed. They had lists of Dutch resistance members who could help organize distribution. They had calculated down to the last kilogram how much food each area needed. This wasn't a vague promise. This was a complete plan that could start within 24 hours. One of the Canadian officers pulled out photographs, images of Dutch children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes, images of bodies in the streets of Amsterdam because people didn't have the strength to bury them anymore, images of hospitals where doctors watched patients die because there was no food, no medicine, no hope. The officer placed them in front of Blaskowitz one by one. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The photographs said everything. Blaskowitz sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the spring afternoon was turning to evening. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled from another front. The war was still happening. People were still dying. But in this schoolhouse, in this moment, everything hung in balance. One man's decision would determine whether millions lived or died. Finally, Blaskowitz spoke. He couldn't agree to surrender terms. Not yet. Berlin might be falling, but he still had officers who would follow Hitler's orders to the end. But he could agree to a ceasefire for helping people in need. He could order his anti-aircraft guns to hold fire. He could allow Allied planes to drop food over occupied territory. And while this was happening, while the Dutch civilians were being fed, he and Foulkes could continue talking about other matters, about the military situation, about the future, about surrender. It wasn't a complete agreement. It wasn't the bloodless liberation that Foulkes hoped for. But it was a start. It was something that had never happened before in this entire war. Two enemy commanders agreeing to work together to save civilian lives, while their armies still faced each other with loaded weapons. Word of the agreement spread quickly through German military channels. In scattered headquarters across occupied Europe, Wehrmacht officers monitoring the situation couldn't understand what was happening. One message captured that evening read, "Blaskowitz has agreed to let enemy bombers fly over our positions without resistance. Request clarification. This contradicts all standing orders." The confusion was just beginning. Within days, the entire German military establishment would be trying to understand how the Netherlands had been lost without a battle. The next morning, April 30th, the first RAF Lancaster bombers appeared over Rotterdam. They flew at exactly 400 feet, so low that people on the ground could see the pilots' faces. The bomb bay doors opened, but instead of explosives, packages tumbled out. Hundreds of packages attached to small parachutes. They drifted down through the spring air and landed in city squares, on rooftops, in parks. German soldiers watched them fall. Their officers had given clear orders. Do not fire. Let them through. Some soldiers couldn't believe it. They stood with their rifles ready, watching enemy aircraft fly overhead, and they didn't shoot. Dutch civilians came out of their homes slowly, carefully, expecting a trick or a trap. They found packages marked with Canadian flags. Inside were cans of meat, bags of flour, chocolate bars, dried milk, real food, the first real food many of them had seen in 6 months. People cried in the streets. They held the packages like they were made of gold. Old women kissed the cans. Children stared at chocolate like they had forgotten such things existed. Within 3 days, over 3,000 tons of food had been dropped. Operation Manna, they called it. Manna from heaven. British and Canadian planes making hundreds of flights at dangerously low heights over German, occupied territory, and not a single shot was fired at them. Blaskowitz had kept his word. His soldiers held their fire, even though every instinct told them to shoot down enemy aircraft. The unprecedented cooperation was working. People were eating. The death count started dropping. 500 per day became 300, then 200, then less. And in the schoolhouse at Achterveld, Foulkes and Blaskowitz kept talking. While the food drops continued, something happened in Berlin that changed everything. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The man who had ordered Germany to fight to the last bullet, who had commanded his armies to burn everything rather than surrender, who had threatened execution for any officer who showed weakness, was dead. The news traveled slowly through broken communication lines, but by May 1st, Blaskowitz knew the government that would have executed him for negotiating with the enemy no longer existed. The main obstacle to surrender had simply removed itself. The food drops continued without pause. By May 4th, over 11,000 tons of supplies had reached Dutch civilians. The before and after numbers told an incredible story. Before the operation began, 4.5 million people faced immediate starvation, with 500 dying every single day. After just 1 week of food drops, the death rate had dropped to fewer than 50 per day. It wasn't perfect. People were still dying. But the catastrophe had been stopped. The mass death had been prevented. Canadian and British air crews had flown over 1,000 missions into German controlled territory, and not one plane had been shot down, not one pilot had been killed. The cooperation between enemies had saved more lives in 1 week than months of combat would have accomplished. In the schoolhouse at Achterveld, the negotiation shifted. Blaskowitz no longer had excuses. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets. The German government that still existed was in complete chaos, with different groups claiming authority, while the nation collapsed around them. Foulkes pressed his advantage. Your 120,000 soldiers are cut off. You have no supplies coming, no reinforcements, no hope of victory. Every day you wait means more of your men will die for nothing. Surrender now, and we can complete the liberation without firing a shot. But the situation was more complicated than simple military logic. Blaskowitz commanded regular German army units, but he didn't command the SS units scattered throughout the Netherlands. These fanatics still believed in Nazi ideas. They still thought Germany could win. They still followed Hitler's final orders, even though Hitler was dead. Blaskowitz knew that if he ordered a general surrender, the SS would call it treason. They would start executing German officers. They might even attack Canadian forces, triggering the very bloodbath that everyone was trying to avoid. The SS had to be handled carefully, like unexploded bombs that could go off at any moment. Intercepted German communications revealed the chaos and disbelief inside Wehrmacht headquarters. Radio operators captured dozens of messages between German generals trying to understand what was happening. One message said, "The Canadians have achieved the impossible. They are feeding our enemies' civilians with our permission, while we still hold our weapons." Another general radioed, "Request clarification on Blaskowitz's actions. This defies all military protocol." A panicked SS commander demanded to know why Blaskowitz was allowing enemy aircraft over German positions. "This is treason against the Pfefführer and the Reich," the SS officer wrote. "I demand immediate explanation." From Berlin. In one of the final clear messages before the government collapsed. A high command officer sent. Situation in Netherlands incomprehensible. Functional army negotiating surrender, while still armed and positioned. This was not how German soldiers were trained to end wars. Blaskowitz didn't respond to most of these messages. He knew the SS would never understand. They had been trained since childhood to value death over dishonor, sacrifice over surrender, destruction over compromise. On May 5th, Blaskowitz made his decision. He sent messages to all his commanders ordering them to prepare for capitulation. Not surrender. Capitulation. The word choice mattered. Surrender meant defeat. Capitulation meant the war was over and continuing to fight served no purpose. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Blaskowitz and his senior officers arrived at Hotel de Wereld in the small town of Wageningen. Canadian officers were already there. The building had been quickly prepared for a formal ceremony. Someone had found a proper table and chairs. A Canadian soldier had typed up the surrender documents on a borrowed typewriter. Outside, Dutch civilians gathered in the streets, whispering nervously, afraid to hope that the occupation might actually end without their cities being destroyed. Blaskowitz signed the documents at 9:15 in the morning. His hand was steady. He showed no emotion. He had commanded armies for Germany, and now he was ending Germany's control over 6 Dutch provinces covering 16,000 square kilometers. 120,000 German soldiers would lay down their weapons. The largest bloodless surrender of the entire war happened with a pen and paper in a small hotel while the spring sun shone through the windows. No artillery barrage, no tank assault, no burning cities. Just signatures on documents and the quiet acceptance that continuing to fight made no sense. The news spread through the Dutch provinces like wildfire. Canadian forces began moving into the major cities within hours. Sherman tanks rolled down streets in Amsterdam, but they weren't firing their guns. They were covered in flowers. Dutch civilians had been saving tulips, hiding them, waiting for this moment. They came out of their homes carrying orange flowers, orange banners, orange ribbons. Orange was the color of the Dutch royal family. Orange was the color of freedom. For 5 years, showing orange had meant arrest or execution. Now people covered every Canadian tank, every jeep, every soldier in orange flowers, until the military vehicles looked like parade floats, instead of instruments of war. The scene in Dam Square in Amsterdam on May 7th was something no one had imagined possible just 2 weeks earlier. Thousands of Dutch civilians packed the square, crying and laughing and singing. Canadian soldiers moved through the crowds, handing out chocolate bars to children who had never tasted chocolate. The church bells of the Nieuw Kerk rang for the first time in 5 years. The Germans had forbidden bell ringing because it might signal resistance activities. Now the bells rang continuously, joining with bells from every church in the city, creating a waterfall of sound that echoed across the canals and through the narrow streets. Old women knelt on the cobblestones and kissed Canadian soldiers' boots. Young girls braided flowers into soldiers' uniforms. Men, who had been in hiding for years, came out from attics and basements, blinking in the sunlight, unable to believe they had survived. Rotterdam, The Hague, Utrecht. The same scenes played out in every liberated city. 2 hours after Blaskowitz signed the surrender documents, Canadian forces had occupied all 6 provinces without firing a shot. The statistics were almost impossible to believe. 0 Allied casualties, 0 German casualties. 0 civilian casualties from combat. In the same week that 80,000 German soldiers and 1,000 Soviet soldiers died fighting over Berlin, the Netherlands had been liberated without adding a single name to the casualty list. But not everyone was celebrating. In the chaos of Germany's collapse, some SS units refused to accept the surrender. Small groups of fanatics, mostly young men who had grown up under Nazi propaganda, tried to continue fighting. They sabotaged bridges. They fired on Canadian patrols. They executed German officers they accused of cowardice. Canadian forces had to hunt them down over the following weeks. But these scattered resistance fighters were doomed. They had no supplies, no support, and no future. By the end of May, even the most dedicated SS holdouts had been captured or killed. The liberation was complete. The scale of what had been accomplished became clear when Canadian military government teams compiled their final reports. 11,000 tons of food delivered during the operation. An estimated 100,000 Dutch civilian lives saved from starvation. 6 provinces liberated in 72 hours. 120,000 German soldiers peacefully disarmed and taken into custody. Compared to regular military operations elsewhere, the numbers were staggering. The Battle of Berlin had taken 2 weeks and killed over 160,000 people to capture one city. The liberation of the Netherlands had taken 3 days and killed no one to liberate 6 provinces. German High Command, what remained of it, struggled to process what had happened. Communications captured after the war showed confused and astonished officers trying to explain to their superiors how such a large military force had simply stopped fighting. The situation in the Netherlands defies standard military analysis. One German general wrote in his journal, "Blaskowitz achieved what appears to be an honorable conclusion to an impossible situation, but by doing so, he violated every principle we were taught." Another high command memo stated, "The bloodless surrender of 6 provinces represents either brilliant pragmatism or catastrophic failure of German military spirit. History will judge." A senior Wehrmacht officer recorded in his diary, "We expected the Canadians to shell our positions for weeks. Instead, they fed our enemy and talked us into submission. This is not the warfare we studied at academy." The Nazi propaganda machine, which had spent years proclaiming that German soldiers would fight to the death, quietly ignored the Netherlands' surrender. It didn't fit their story. It couldn't be explained, so they pretended it hadn't happened. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, just 3 days after the Netherlands' liberation. But for the Dutch people and the Canadian soldiers who freed them, May 5th became the date that mattered most. While the rest of the world celebrated Victory in Europe Day on the 8th, the Netherlands marked Liberation Day on the 5th. It wasn't just another date on the calendar. It was the day their nation came back to life without being destroyed in the process. It was the day they learned that sometimes enemies could choose humanity over hatred, negotiation over destruction, wisdom over warfare. In the months after liberation, the bond between Canada and the Netherlands grew stronger, in ways that no one expected. Dutch families began adopting the graves of Canadian soldiers who had died fighting to free their country, not just caring for them or visiting them occasionally, but actually adopting them as family members. They placed flowers on the graves every week. They learned the soldiers' names and histories. They told their children stories about these young men who had traveled across an ocean to fight for strangers. By the end of 1945, all 7,600 Canadian war graves in the Netherlands had been adopted by Dutch families. Every single one. The practice continued for decades. Grandparents who had lived through the liberation taught their grandchildren to care for these graves. The dead Canadian soldiers became part of Dutch families, remembered and honored as if they were blood relatives. The Dutch government wanted to show gratitude in a more visible way. In 1946, the Netherlands sent 20,000 tulip bulbs to Ottawa, Canada's capital. It was meant as a one-time gift, a simple thank you for liberation. But the gesture touched something deep in both nations. The tulips bloomed in Ottawa's parks that spring, covering the grounds in colors that reminded everyone of what the liberation had meant. The gift became an annual tradition. Every single year since 1946, the Netherlands has sent 20,000 tulip bulbs to Canada. For almost 80 years now, without missing a single year, tulips from the Netherlands have bloomed in Ottawa as a living reminder of liberation and friendship. The Canadian Tulip Festival, which started to celebrate these gifts, became one of the largest tulip festivals in the world. Millions of people visit Ottawa each May to see flowers that represent one of history's most enduring international friendships. Charles Foulkes, the Canadian general who risked his career and reputation to negotiate instead of attack, received recognition from multiple nations after the war. The Dutch government awarded him the Knight Grand Cross of the Order of Orange, Nassau, one of their highest honors. The British appointed him as a commander of the Order of the Bath. He continued his military career, eventually becoming chief of the General Staff of the Canadian Army. But Foulkes never spoke much about the Netherlands' liberation. When asked about it in interviews, he deflected credit to his soldiers and to the Dutch people themselves. He seemed uncomfortable with praise for doing what he considered simple common sense. Why would you destroy cities and kill civilians if you could achieve the same military objective through negotiation? The question seemed obvious to him, even though the answer had escaped military planners for most of human history. Johannes Blaskowitz received no recognition from Germany. He couldn't. In German eyes, he had surrendered a functional army that still held its weapons and positions. He had worked with the enemy. He had violated Hitler's final orders. When the war ended, Blaskowitz was arrested by the Allies, not as a hero, but as a war criminal. He was charged with various offenses related to his earlier service in Poland. The trial dragged on for 3 years. On February 5, 1948, the day before his sentencing was scheduled to be read, Blaskowitz jumped to his death from a window in the courthouse. He was 60 years old. Some historians believe he couldn't live with the dishonor of being labeled a war criminal. Others think he knew he would be convicted and wanted to die on his own terms. The German soldier who had saved millions of Dutch lives by choosing negotiation over destruction ended his own life in shame and isolation. History rarely rewards those who show mercy to the enemy, even when that mercy saves countless innocent lives. The approach that Foulkes pioneered in the Netherlands became studied and analyzed by military strategists around the world. Before 1945, traditional military thinking held that you fought until the enemy surrendered unconditionally or was destroyed completely. Negotiated settlements were seen as weakness. Talking to the enemy during active combat was considered dangerous and potentially treasonous. But the Netherlands' liberation proved that another way was possible, that military objectives could sometimes be achieved through humanitarian cooperation, that understanding your enemy's impossible position could be more powerful than overwhelming force. These lessons became foundation stones for modern peacekeeping operations and conflict resolution strategies that emerged in the decades after World War II. The United Nations peacekeeping forces, established in 1948, drew heavily on the Netherlands' liberation as a case study. Military observers noted that Foulkes had succeeded because he understood that the German commanders in the Netherlands were trapped in an impossible situation. They couldn't win. They couldn't retreat. They couldn't get supplies or reinforcements. Fighting would accomplish nothing except death. By offering them a way to end the situation that didn't require suicide charges or last stands, Foulkes gave them permission to act on what they already knew was true. Modern peacekeeping operations adopted this approach. Find the shared interests. Identify the points where even enemies can agree. Build from those points toward larger settlements. It doesn't always work. Sometimes enemies truly want nothing but the other side's destruction. But when it does work, the results can be miraculous. The relationship between Canada and the Netherlands evolved into something unique in international relations. It wasn't just diplomatic friendliness or trade partnerships. It was genuine affection between entire populations. Dutch schoolchildren learned Canadian history. Canadian veterans made pilgrimages to the Netherlands and were treated like royalty everywhere they went. When Princess Margriet of the Netherlands was born in 1943 in Ottawa, where the Dutch royal family had taken refuge during the war, the Canadian government temporarily declared her hospital room extraterritorial so she would have exclusive Dutch citizenship. When these veterans grew old and began dying, Dutch families attended their funerals in Canada. When the last survivors of the liberation visited the Netherlands in their 80s and 90s, Dutch crowds lined the streets to cheer them. The gratitude never faded. It never became routine or hollow. It remained genuine across generations. Every May 5th, Liberation Day celebrations in the Netherlands include Canadian flags flying alongside Dutch flags. Canadian military personnel are invited to participate in ceremonies. Dutch children wave at Canadian soldiers who represent the nation that freed their great-grandparents. The speeches given on Liberation Day consistently emphasize not just the freedom that was won, but how it was won. The liberation of the Netherlands stands as proof that even in total war, even when facing fanatic enemies, even when conventional wisdom demands violence, there can be another way. Military genius doesn't always mean knowing how to fight. Sometimes it means knowing when fighting serves no purpose and having the courage to choose a different path. The modern lessons from this story remain powerfully relevant. We live in a time of increasing division and conflict. Nations threaten each other with destruction. Political groups view compromise as betrayal, the language of warfare. Of total victory and unconditional surrender dominates discussion about everything from politics to business to personal relationships. But the liberation of the Netherlands reminds us that even in the darkest moments of human history, even between enemies who had spent years trying to kill each other, wisdom and humanity could win. Two generals looked at an impossible situation and chose to save lives rather than follow the rule book. They chose negotiation over violence. They chose the harder path of talking to enemies, rather than the easier path of simply destroying them. The lesson isn't that violence is never necessary. Sometimes it is. The lesson is that violence isn't always necessary, even when everyone assumes it is. The lesson is that the most powerful military victories sometimes come without firing a shot. That true strength includes the wisdom to know when your enemy is beaten and the mercy to let them accept it without pointless bloodshed. That innovation in warfare isn't just better weapons or tactics, but better thinking about what warfare is supposed to accomplish. 6 Dutch provinces, 16,000 square kilometers, 4.5 million people, all freed in 72 hours without a battle. It happened because 2 men chose to see their enemies as human beings trapped in an impossible situation, rather than as targets to be destroyed. That choice, that moment of wisdom amid the madness of war, created a friendship between nations that has lasted 80 years and shows no sign of ending. Sometimes the greatest victories are the battles we choose not to fight.